Good afternoon and welcome to JI's online webinar. Because Islamabad never has a dull moment, we thought we would have this webinar online, and so that it would be easier for all those who participated across Pakistan, for all of them to tune in. The launch of the report takes its name from a rigorous research exercise and the expansive theme of resilience that took many months of unpacking. As our team traveled through Pakistan, speaking to communities, and connecting the dots between the national resilience agenda and what our outcomes look like in the field. The question we kept returning to was whether resilience occurs in the same way it is intended, and how do communities themselves identify the hallmarks of resilience? How many steps is it away from vulnerability? And also, which districts in Pakistan are more secure or resilient than others? To shed light on this and talk about their own niche on resilience, we have a distinguished panel of experts today. This launch is going to be chaired by Senator Rehman, President JI and former Federal Minister for Climate Change. Her Excellency, Jane Marriott, the British High Commissioner in Pakistan. Her Excellency, Alexandra Berg von Linde, the Ambassador of Sweden to Pakistan. Dr. Ijaz Nabi, Country Director for the International Growth Center. Dr. Faisal Bari, the Dean of the LUMS School of Education. And Ms. Sofia Shakil, Director, Human and Social Development, Asian Development Bank. We are honored to host these distinguished panelists today. And with that, Senator Rehman, may I request you to give your opening thoughts on the research exercise that JI conducted, as well as the larger theme of resilience.
Thank you, Salman, and thank you, Jinnah Institute, for convening this important report launch, albeit on the web. Exciting for me because resilience has been one of the cornerstones of climate adaptation and policy across the country, and one of the most used buzzwords in its application across the board in Pakistan and we see in the climate and environment communities everywhere. It is, however, very loosely applied in my mind in Pakistan, whether you're looking at preparedness or early risk or communities who adapt in different ways to the cycles of heat and storms, as well as glacial melt and forest fires, among many other manifestations, let alone flooding of climate change, which Pakistan has become the epicenter of. So while we look at resilience, there seems to have been little measure of it in terms of how people on the ground are weathering this change, how they are actually locking into any kind of created capacity for them, or how they respond to state policies, how they respond to programming from their province or from the national disaster management or from external agencies that particularly reach out to assist with resilience at a provincial or community scale. Now, what we have been doing is for working on this for over a year in the provinces of Pakistan, identifying people who are at risk in different ways on the ground, not just recording their voices, but looking at them as agents of change, people who create their own measures of resilience and who have expectations, not just from the state, but from all actors in the climate and environment space. Now, here, we tend to speak about this constantly, that, local communities have got to be part of the exercise, and adaptation frameworks have a great deal of meaning. And while we say that, the country response still tends to be fragmented, and we note that while provinces are struggling to meet head-on the changes and the crises that and the shocks that communities face, this remains, resilience largely remains unmapped and misunderstood on the ground as an all encompassing response, which, to me becomes like a be all of a climate response. So very often people just say, well, here's the adaptation manual and this is what the community must do. Whereas what we find is that the communities are feeling increasingly left out. They are feeling increasingly on their own in terms of responding when a disaster hits. And yes, while we have a fair amount of maximum overstretch and a number of crises that are epically mentioned globally across the board, that are epically impacted our country, and you all know about the 2022 floods, but even 2025. These are headline events. But behind the headline events, you have in this crisis century entire countries, entire provinces, and swathes of regions that are facing off calamities and catastrophes on their own. This is not endemic only to Pakistan. This is not something that Pakistan is experiencing on its own. I understand Asia is the epicenter of a new heat-related crises. Every day there's a new report on climate change. The response multilaterally is, as we all know, shrinking. And we kind of also tend to reduce the entire problem to a bottleneck on financing. So while we're talking about financing, I always like to remind people that the money is certainly there. It is the choices that global leadership makes in allocating to people, in allocating funds and resources and attention to people. So I really value everybody here today. Two of our speakers have been peer reviewers, Mr. Nabi and Mr. Bari. Thank you for that. But also thank you to all of you for being actors and agents on the ground in Pakistan, certainly in your capacities, either both the ambassadors in your programmatic approaches, as well as your consciousness of how to make better interventions in your own capacities. But, really, for us, you're here as people who have been involved in climate action and programmatic activities in the country, and with unique views on how you can put capital, both private, national, and of course international, to use to minimize risk at its best usage in the country. Now, when I say money is available, of course, it is not a choice that you and I or any of us make, but it's not just about money. It's about enabling people to act on the ground with agency and action in ways they can actually respond to a growing multiple crisis. So there are hard choices in every province, in every community to be made, but the measure of these crises, I think, is captured somewhat in this report, in the sense that development, and it's a truism that you all may know about, but development and access to development has been, or social indicators tell us that all communities where women were better educated or had better empowerment, higher empowerment, or communities which had better access to health facilities as well as education, obviously were more urban. So while the findings may seem very self-explanatory, I think they bear a responsible telling of this story in how these development indicators actually impact people's abilities to cope with cascading crises, and how we can move across the board in terms of advisories, in terms of intervention, in terms of making programmatic changes to impact people who we call the wealth of nations. So people of each country are called the wealth of each nation. And while we have a 64% youth bulge, they are an unharnessed resource, and they are all, as you may notice, interested in becoming climate conscious citizens. So with those words, I'm going to really hold back on further talk. Salman, over to you. It would be good if there was a quick summation of the report, if possible, attached to this conversation, because every panelist here is going to be responding to a different set of questions. So thank you very much for doing this, and I will thank all of you in the end.
Thank you, Sandra Saiba, for creating that superscript for this report, as well as running the gamut from the demand side to the supply side. The very many questions about adaptation, about resilience, as well as the state of fragmentation that exists between agencies, between the multilateral level, as well as the free fall often between manual and between the maladaptation that occurs in the field. There are very, very many degrees of free fall where communities fall through the cracks, really. And that was our finding again and again, province to province, community to community. But I'd like to refer the perspective on multilateral support to the High Commissioner. And, what with the conflict in the Middle East going on, we do know that attention spans and priorities are devoted now increasingly towards defense and security. Shall we take it for granted that the resilience agenda will occur or go on unaffected? Or shall we think about adjusting to smaller, funding cycles? The UK has been funding a lot of adaptation work, but I'd like to hear from the High Commissioner on what her thoughts are on international climate assistance.
Thank you very much indeed, and sorry for the quick location change. Just got a fire alarm going off at the moment. So I think the key thing for us around adaptation is what we've seen around the shift from reactive responses to prevention and preparedness. Including, for example, I was at NDMA a couple of weeks ago, and I took, my key takeaway there was that we had pivoted from anticipatory, sort of responsive, reactive responses to anticipatory. So looking, for example, at evacuation of floodplains in advance. The second thing the UK is really focused on is around our climate partnership and the Green Compact. So in particular, how we can help support risk reduction, system readiness, particularly around things like early warning and by embedding resilience within planning and finance systems. So I think a key phrase for us is kind of think national or think federal, but act local. So we've seen that the federal and provincial initiatives can be good and can be helpful, but delivery needs to be very, very localized, and it needs finance, institutions, and citizen accountability moving closely together to do so. So we've seen how local systems can provide adaptation, they can act more quickly, and the communities know what they want. They know what's best, the best response is on the ground. But it's also essential to have that two-way communication feed. So what you're getting from the communities on resilience and adaptation can be fed back up into planning at the provincial and the federal level and back down the chain along the way. One of the key things we've been working on with NDMA, for example, is also around how we do early warning actions. So how can we best build on community early warnings, but also how do we make those inclusive? Because we know that the most vulnerable in society are the ones who take longer to recover, whether that is women or marginalised group. So deaf people, for example, we've started supporting, we've initiated support for those who are deaf, those who are hard of hearing, so that they also know that there is an early warning system around. And I just want to add one final point, which is around journalism training. So I think I've been struck since I got here around the relative lack of coverage of climate stories. Dawn, I think, does a fantastic job. We saw its conference earlier in the year about climate resilience, but we've also seen challenges around what that looks like on the ground. So we've set up multiple journalism training workshops. I know we're not the only ones who've been doing that sort of thing, that have translated into numerous climate-related stories across the media. But I just wanted to highlight one story in particular, which was our award-winning entry, which was near Multan. and the journalist who is a big believer in climate change and sees that we need to adapt to the realities of climate change. To his own surprise, the story when he talked to people on the ground was that they were dying. It was literally people who did not have enough to drink, and they said, it's because Allah wills it. So on the ground, I think there's a real question for us about how much do people understand climate change, and how much do they understand that they have agency and are a key part of the response and a key part of that community resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner. One of our key findings from the report was to also assess how vulnerability looks different to resilience. Often there is a continuum, but as we found, it is graduated steps away from vulnerability by capacitating communities, by providing key resources, that they become resilient. I'd like to ask the ambassador, what in her work and her sort of review of such programming, what key strengths have emerged? How has vulnerability reduced, especially among marginalized groups like women or youths? What have you seen, Ambassador?
Well, assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. And of course, thank you so much to Jinnah Institute for inviting me to be part of this very, very important conversation. And just also to say that a couple of weeks ago when I sat down with Senator Rehman, and she talked me through the Road of Resilience report, something that really stood out to me immediately, and that was and became apparent was the importance that the reports does in the effort of listening, to really listen to the ones that live with the reality of climate change. So I think that the report, that makes the report both timely and relevant and very necessary. Because of course, and as also has been mentioned, when we look at climate change, vulnerability, resilience, it's very easy to look at it from a top-down approach and stay at a high level. We speak about the policies and the funding and the global commitments and the programming, but for the people that are involved, this is not an abstract issue. It's about losing your home, losing sometimes worst case scenario, your life, your livelihood. And so for me, if we start speaking about yardsticks for defining resilience and vulnerability, this would be the central part, that it's not about having one static and fixed definition, but rather looking at it at whether and how people are equipped to deal with change and with uncertainty in their daily lives. And as you also mentioned, we also know that when women and young people they are often the ones that are at the very forefront of climate change and impact, and they are feeling it most strongly. So if you would look at the concept, I think that for my part, at least 3 elements are there. One is definitely inclusion. Like, do women have a voice in decisions that affect their lives? Can they move freely? Do they have access to services, control over resources? Because we know, and this is like factually in many, many different studies proven, that when women have space, we consistently see stronger outcomes, not just for them, but their families and entire communities. And of course, reversely, lack of inclusion would mean that well, it leads to more vulnerability, less resilience for the excluded group. And here we are then speaking about, half of the population. A second element would be access to opportunities, and then especially for youth. Are young people able to get an education, developing skills and finding meaningful work which can build their resilience? Or are they left with very limited options? Because again, we know that when young people feel stuck, it affects not only their future, but also the stability of the wider community. And third then is digitalization and access to information and systems that actually work and that are, accessible to vulnerable people. And this can be everything from early warning systems, social protection, digital connectivity. Of course, they make a real difference in whether people can prepare and can respond to a crisis and build their resilience. So from a Swedish perspective, when we integrate the gender perspective lens into all this. This is not a separate discussion. It's at the very, very core of building resilience. So we see very clearly across different contexts that when women and youth have access to all these elements, they are simply better prepared, they recover faster. And this has been seen, I think, by all of you in practice as well. In many communities across the country, across the region, women are already taking on leadership roles in building resilience, including organizing support, sharing information, helping families adapt. So that is a very efficient way of going from being the first victims of a crisis to actually being the early responders, or even the change makers. And an observation here is, of course, that they do this in many places not because there is a system or it's despite the system that is in place. So for me, I guess that part of the yardstick is whether we are removing those barriers and whether when women and young people are being supported and not held back. And I think that the report really highlights the fact that solutions sometimes are designed at a distance. But if women, girls, youth are not part of shaping those solutions, we risk missing what is actually going on in the ground. So when they are excluded, the responses tend to be, when they are included, the responses tend to be more relevant, more practical, more sustainable, and that you can see regardless of the challenge that you have in front of you. And I think that that is really what the report is about.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's very gratifying to hear. One of our consistent findings from the field was that wherever women have ownership of assets, those communities are far, far ahead in achieving what they do, and there's far greater resilience. I'd like to ask a similar question from Dr. Faisal Bari, because he worked on the National Human Development Report some years ago, which was themed on youth. Sir, have you, in these 10 years after that report, have you found that social policy has moved ahead to assist youth? What is the youth resilience agenda now in Pakistan?
So thank you, Jinnah Institute and Salman and Senator Rehman. Let me just say that I think a lot of our social protection policy it started very well. It created the institutions that we needed, but is still in some ways stuck at a very reactive way of dealing with any kind of emergency. And this we saw in when COVID-19 also hit, and the economic shock was significant, that it took us quite a few months to ramp up the programming for how we could help people who were hit very hard by COVID-19 and the closing of everything. And then this has happened in the floods as well. After the floods, it took us quite some time to ramp up how we were going to help people. So one thing is, which was already mentioned, that we need to move to a much more anticipatory way of doing things. But that's not enough, in the sense that anticipation can be there to some climate change activities, whether it be flood or some of these economic shocks, etc. But the resilience is built on the strengths that lie within the household, right? So we have to say, do households have savings, for example, whether it be in shape of physical assets or land or whatever? And do they have education, which is an investment and a saving as well in human capital, obviously? If they don't have that, then it is very hard to see how social protection and even anticipatory systems can help households, other than providing aid, of course, to be resilient, right? Their ability to cope with any change becomes very limited by the fact that they don't have either savings or human capital for adaptability, etc. And those are much more long-term investments, not in social protection institutions, but in institutions that go along with social protection and create that platform or framework or foundation on which then the social protection and other things come in. And that, I think, is where we've consistently had problems, whether it be public health area, provision of water and sanitation, education, and the other basics that are needed for that, and which is shown in our numbers in infant mortality, the number of children out of school, and so on. And I think that's where a lot more work needs to be done. But that is not emergency work. That is more medium to long-term work for creating the foundation on which resilience can be built. Then I think the any anticipatory effort or reactionary effort would have a much more of a marginal impact in helping people if the underlying foundation is stronger. With a weak foundation, it's very hard to have large enough anticipatory or even reactive programs that will be able to help people fully.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. In many ways, you set the stage for a question on the effectiveness of social protection, and Sofia Shakil Sahiba leads a lot of the transformative programming by the ADB in Pakistan. Sofia Shakil Sahiba, is social protection considered the silver bullet for alleviating many of Pakistan's problems, and is there an over-reliance on it sometimes?
Yeah, thank you, Salman, and thank you, Jinnah Institute, Senator Rehman, and all my, esteemed co-panelists. And it's really nice to see you, Faisal, as well. Thank you for this question, because I think, this is something that we in Asian Development Bank have been partnering with the government of Pakistan to support social protection and expand it. So my answer in short is yes. I think there is a structural over-reliance. But the issue is not social protection itself. It's really how narrowly it is being used. So programs like the Benazir Income Support Program and ASAS have been absolutely critical in cushioning households against the repeated economic and climate shocks. And, as we know, these are only getting more and more frequent. The evidence from your Road to Resilience report shows that districts with stronger social protection coverage tend to demonstrate better resilience outcomes. However, we really need to distinguish between passive social protection and simply relying on cash transfers, and then the adaptive social protection. So at present, cash transfers are doing most of the heavy lifting, and they help households cope, but they are not systematically linked to, livelihood, skills, employment pathways, or climate adaptation measures. Of course, some are conditional to school enrollment and nutrition outcomes, but really linking it to livelihoods and and building the resilience that everybody's been talking about. This is where adaptive social protection comes in, combining social assistance with active labor market programs, graduation initiatives that specifically target those families that are receiving these cash transfers to be able to build the kind of skills to enhance pathways to livelihoods or employment. So skills development and asset formation, these become essential. And as your report shows, where asset formation especially is amassed, especially among women and embedded in like strong community institutions, it is much more, it creates for more resilience. So when designed this way, I think social protection can support transitions from vulnerability to resilience. And cash transfers in social protection should be the entry point and not the end point. And this is where we are actually hoping to, deepen the engagement of, from our end to support, the deepening of social protection to move it towards more adaptive and working with, the provinces and as well as at local levels.
Dr. Jasab, there's $1 million question underwriting all of this, and it is about who pays for all of this, right? There's macroeconomic stabilization happening at one end, but there is microeconomic stress that still occurs. Do you think there is a dichotomy between these two trends? where we are reporting good numbers after a while, but communities are still hurting very much, and this may continue for the foreseeable future. If you see this dichotomy, what do you make of it?
So first of all, let me congratulate you. The report has come a long way since the draft you shared with me earlier. It's more direct. The messages are clear. So what I'm going to do is this macro-micro distinction that you've talked about, it's not so clear to most people. You're right. We do have macroeconomic stability. What we don't have is growth. And hastening growth before stability has really gelled has its own risks. If we don't make the kinds of transformation that we need to make in the economy, whether it's investments in agriculture or it's investments in industry, the risk is that if we start growing rapidly, we will go back to the problem of instability. So we need to wait this out and make sure that we have put in place the structural changes which will give us sustained growth over a period of time. Now, I want to relate my comments to the central messages of the report. The report does a great job of saying that there is inequality in the way districts experience resilience, and that we really need, in order to have sustainable growth, sustainable response to climate change, sustainable response to the kinds of catastrophic events that happen in our country, we need to address those inequalities that we have as measured in a host of variables that you have reported in your paper. Some of those variables are clear, and we know how to link those up in the budgets that get formulated at the federal level and the provincial level. For example, agriculture will have a big role to play. We know where agriculture fits into the budget and how to tweak technologies to make sure that resilience gets built into the technology as we move forward. We know, for example, in the social sectors where the budgets are formulated and how to tweak those. But the report seems to suggest that there is this additional factor there, which is kind of a social capital of communities, and that the social capital of communities also needs to be built up in order to strengthen resilience. That's an implied message of the report. It doesn't, unfortunately, come out very clearly what that social capital is, but it's an implied message, and I think a very important message. So one of the things we'll need to do going forward is to bring out those social dimensions of resilience. And I say this because to give traction to the framework that you have developed in this report, you will need to align your report with some of the key points of decision making that will have an impact at the community level. The biggest point of interaction in the current state of affairs is IMF's program. The IMF's program now has a very clear window of resilience. When you look at the 5 major interventions that will strengthen resilience according to that framework, some of those fit in with the kinds of issues that you're raising in this report. Water management, for example, stands out very clearly. But the concept of social capital, the concept of acting, designing interventions at the community level is not captured in any of those 5 big measures of resilience that the IMF framework talks about. Now, I think it'd be fantastic if your report can begin to provide that kind of a linkage, so that when the Ministry of Climate Change develops a program which has budgetary implications, and then the Ministry of Finance talks to the IMF and says, can we have additional fiscal space because we are interpreting the concept of resilience in a very novel way. We think there are community dimensions of social capital which should be addressed. And this takes development right down to the district level. And therefore, we want to create space for fiscal resources to be spent to provide those public goods. Now, I think that's a link that needs to be made. Once you make that link, then you really take this whole debate of can we have sustainable growth to the next level. Because all of us are now incorporating concepts of sustainability in our growth work. The International Growth Center, supported by FCDO UK, has climate change dimensions and the resilience to climate change dimensions built in all of its 4 major themes of agriculture, of governance, of city management, of energy. Climate change dimensions are built into those. But what is not built into those explicitly is the framework that your report provides, which is how do you take it down to the community level? What are the public goods that we need to keep in mind when we are designing agricultural interventions, when we are designing city management, when we are talking about new ways of delivering energy? So that's the direction in which it'd be fantastic if you can take this report, because then it becomes a framework which can be applied at the working level, at different levels of decision-making in the government. I had mentioned this earlier, and I'd like to emphasize again, there are very few public entities that are working with this concept of communities. One that stands out very clearly is the Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund. It does a lot of its work with the kind of interaction with communities that you did while writing this report. And they designed their interventions being very aware of what those public goods are that can be provided. Now, of course, if we had strong local governments, we would not need a Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Program, because strong local governments would be doing exactly that. But given where we are, I think it'd be a good idea to work very closely with Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund to point out exactly what the point of interactions are between investment and delivery of community services, which have the kind of resilience your report talks about.
Thank you, Dr. Saab, for that very encouraging intervention. I recall now the many discussions we had while drafting the report, and your wisdom on trimming it down on the fundamental question that you just brought up: who becomes the arbiter of public goods, public resilience goods, if you like, for communities? Is it communities themselves? Is it local government? Who is it? And I think perhaps we can come back to this question in a little bit, but I'd like to bring the High Commissioner and refer a thought by Dr. Ijaz Nabi Saab. So, the idea is that programming then stops at some point. It's top heavy, it starts somewhere. Can programming, and particularly adaptation finance, match the scale of community resilience needs?
So I don't want to depress everybody after the sort of slightly more upbeat discussion that we've just had. But no, the climate financing gap is absolutely huge. When I arrived here 3 years ago now, the statistic that was on everybody's lips was the World Bank stat that it would take $348 billion by 2030 to close the gap on resilience financing and climate change. We're 3 years on. That gap has not shrunk, but we've got fewer years to try and meet it. So I fear that although we all know, and the report I think is absolutely brilliant at bringing out the importance of communities and community deliverance and community resilience, I'm afraid I don't think we're seeing anything systemic between what we've got at the very top in terms of climate financing and what we're seeing meeting on the ground. Now, there are some good regional initiatives, for example, in pretty much all of the provinces, so whether that's Sindh's Delta Blue campaign or Lahore's Green Corridor or KP's reforestation, but at the very, very root community level, it's just not getting close. So there are, as I say, good practice. So the UK supported the Green Bond. We're building institutional capacity. We're helping mobilize some private sector capacity building and funding as well. But at the moment, the gap is too great, which is why, as you know, one of the things that Senator Rehman has repeatedly said and comes out in the report, you've got to integrate climate into absolutely everything. It is not an add-on. It needs to be a key part of policy making, a key part of planning, a key part of financing at the local level, which is why, as our previous speaker mentioned, local governance, local government is so very important. Where is the funding going there? How are they building that into community resilience? And where's the transparency so that people can see where the funding is going to on the ground? So this feels like it should be a real push, not just in Pakistan. I think across the world, countries are also struggling with this conundrum and the gap that we are seeing. And of course, as you also briefly discussed there, the gap affects people differently. So we know that women and marginalised groups are much more vulnerable. So yes, we need big initiatives, but it's really community resilience, but it's how you bridge that gap in between. And that means taking the systemic solutions to the community level through very practical empowerment and agency on the ground, through financing local government and transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Ambassador, if we were to make communities the arbiter of their own public goods and services, what interventions or what kind of programming do you think we should do for them to be able to uplift themselves and to create resilience?
Yeah, I thank you for that question. I don't think it's easy to answer. And I think that my short answer is that there is no real programming that can uplift communities in that manner. And just let me elaborate that a little bit. So I think the starting point here, and it has been underlined by previous speaker, is that we need to recognize that this is not something that can be solved quickly. It's not something that can be solved by any actor, nor donor, nor programming. Climate change and the vulnerability that comes with climate change is a true cross-cutting issue, and that requires really a multi-stakeholder approach. So from our side, we believe in staying engaged for the long term. And if we only respond through programming when something happens, then we will always be one step behind. So building resilience needs to be done proactively, not reactively. And that's, of course, any actor. So trying to look at it holistically, which means looking at the bigger picture. Looking at how system functions, what role does the government and the local government have, how are communities connected to basic services, what do people need in their daily lives. Sometimes it's really not about those big programs and interventions, but it is about basic things, basic social services, access to energy, better information, digital connectivity. And I guess that, to maybe further elaborate, we also see that in every crisis and every urgency, there is an opportunity. So trying to look at it from a glass full perspective, one of the ways that Sweden looks at the climate change and climate vulnerability is also through the sustainability and the green transition perspective. So not only about reducing emissions, but really creating new jobs, improving health, building more stable and resilient societies. So you can do that through a variety of different ways. We have different tools in our toolbox that we all use, everything from climate finance to looking at green and sustainable projects and partnerships. But it is very, very much a shared effort. So another piece in this puzzle that I think is important is not looking at this through purely from the development perspective, but development funding and programming can only be part of the answer. We need innovation, we need technology, we need long-term investment, and in this private sector engagement will be an important part in building the resilience of societies. So moving beyond this short-term perspective, short-term projects towards solutions that actually strengthen systems, strengthen institutions, and strengthen government over time. And of course, none of this can be done without partnerships and and it cannot be done without trust between different stakeholders. So bringing together government, communities, businesses, partners, genuinely listens to the communities affected. I think that's where you will start seeing more meaningful and lasting change.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to change tack a little bit and refer a different question on data to Dr. Faisal Bari, who helped us construct the Resilience Index. That's one of the pillars of the report. Dr. Saab, do you think the Resilience Index actually helps shine a light on which districts are better? Or, as you know, there's a lot of cynicism on indices as well, but it opens up a debate. Where do you think this debate on resilience is going with the Resilience Index?
So look, I think there are two or three issues here with that come with any index that you make, and we've had. I mean, I've been involved in making from youth index to various forms of HDI, etc., for quite some time. One is you need a lot of data to create indices at a local level. And many times in Pakistan, we don't have exactly the data that we need. Then we look for what is the best variable that is closest to the data that we have at the level that we can go to. So it's lovely to be able to go down to district, sub-district level, etc. But data availability becomes an issue. And I think one thing that the report will do and the index will do, and creating the effort to create an index will do, is highlight what data do we need, what data should government be collecting about various things, and so on. And I think that's an important contribution to make and highlight that over the years, these are the things on at the community level, household level, etc., that we need so that we can make more informed decisions as well as track things much better. The second part of it is there will always be, anytime you make an index, there will always be questions about which variables have you taken and what weights have you given to these variables. And that's okay. That's a recursive process in the sense that think about HDI, think about other things. We've had many iterations of these over the years, and they get better over time, or they change over time and evolve with the needs, etc. So there's, there is a need to take due caution, make it very transparent, but then let it evolve over time. So you're not going to have tremendous accuracy in any index because it aggregates a huge amount of data. But I think what it does contribute to, and this we saw when we did the youth index as well, is it allows for comparisons, not between districts that are too close to each other, but districts that are rather further apart. If the districts are, because the index, the margin of error is always going to be there to a certain extent. So as long as the districts are fairly far apart, you can say something meaningful about there must be differences in them. And this can be done at district or sub-district, whatever is the level that's available. We can do that at that level. And that's a huge contribution to make, because we can see, is it because some districts have, climate is going to be different. The agri zone that they're in is going to be different. Water availability or other things might be different. So it might very well be that there are things that we can't do in a district, but can be done in other districts. Or it might require a lot more work to be able to do something in an arid district versus in a canal-fed district, etc. So to that extent, I think the contribution is very significant and needs to be made so that a debate can start about inter-district differences and what we can learn from them. Salman, please give me just one more minute. I want to go back to something that was said earlier, not about the index, but that Ijaz had pointed out about community level. I think there's no doubt about it that involvement of community and local people and will help with resilience. But I do want to point out a bit of a problem here, because I don't want to give an easy ride to government, because Government needs to do these things. We don't have local government, so we can't take away the responsibility of government to do a lot of these things in these communities. I also want to point out that over the last 20, 30 years, with all the privatization and everything that has been going on, where water, health, education, a lot of these have been privatized, and middle class, upper classes have moved out of public systems into private systems. The Hirschman exit voice loyalty sort of framework and its consequences. So now it is very hard to see how communities can come together. What are the platforms on which they come together? What is common among them communities? Are they involved with each other in a number of things in terms of public health, in terms of public provision of water or sanitation or this or that? A lot of those things have broken down to a certain extent. So the effort that will be needed to bring back community and notions of community and social capital in Pakistan is not going to be that easy. Obviously, there will be differences between rural and urban areas. There'll be differences across rural areas in various provinces and ethnic groups and communities also. But by and large, I find this is going to be quite a difficult exercise now to create this social capital that Ijaz was talking about. But if local government is not going to be there, then we have to try these things to make sure that we have at least some platforms available to build on.
Thank you, Dr. I think that also points towards one of the glaring gaps that emerged in our research as well. We saw this entire trend of out-migration from villages, the breakdown of traditional community, the kind of entire cities turning into slums, where grievance redressal mechanisms do not help, where people do not have CNICs. The kind of social breakdown that is occurring at such a level was a concern. And I'd like to refer what Dr. Faisal Bari just said to Sofia Shakil. If you could very briefly, we're running out of time, come in on some of the concerns that he put down, and then over to Ijaz Nabi Sahab also for a brief response. Sofia?
Sure. Sure. I mean, this is a really interesting, set of points, because definitely, local level, resilience will come from the communities and building local level institutions. And I think this data that, Dr. Bari, you were referring to district wise, you will also see that, different types of districts, whether you divide them up geographically by poverty levels, or by, whether they're arid, or whether they, what kind of, economic base they have, it directly correlates with the type of local institutions, community institutions that respond. I spent a lot of time of my earlier career with the Aga Khan Rural Support Program in the northern areas. And there, because there was a different type of livelihoods pattern, community organization was of a very different nature to build that sort of resilience and, have community responses. So I think, we need to recognize that it is important to have that local and community level, but it's going to be different. You're going to need different approaches and different institutions. And so here I would just want to say a couple of, things from policy angle, like, what are those things that are going to make us, resilience, which is, this is a multidimensional, problem that you have pointed out, including in your report. So from an operational perspective, I think in addition to providing, those kind of like social protection measures, you really need to focus on livelihoods. And, we need programs, whether they're delivered by public sector, like with actor labor market programs, or by, linking people, connecting people to jobs through private employers, climate-linked public works, or other graduation initiatives. These are going to have to come together. The second thing is, sustained investment in human capital and basic services. I mean, I think all the panelists have spoken about that. It's health and education, but also water, sanitation, energy, which is foundational. The other is the need to scale investments in risk reduction and climate smart infrastructure, including, it's been referred to earlier, developing early warning systems, but flood resistance housing, whenever these investments are going in, the concept of build back better and smarter, with nature-based solutions. I think we're going to have to also, from government side, I think ensure that, that public investment going is done in a way that is resilient. This can reduce the frequency and severity of shocks when they do hit, because you will have that sort of physical resilience. And then finally, I'm just going to reemphasize that what everybody has said, resilience must be built locally, provinces, districts, and local governments. Now, local governments, we know the story of local governments and how they're pretty much non-existent. But these, the public sector needs to get closer to communities, and that's where I really believe partnerships with community-based organizations, local institutions, and either in the private sector or not-for-profit are going to be key. And one final dimension that I must say that in Pakistan, despite the scale of vulnerability, resilience has always been kind of shown, but it's uneven, and it's really through a mix of formal and informal systems. So one anomaly which we see in Pakistan, and it's a very positive thing, is Pakistan's extraordinary culture of philanthropy and social solidarity. And there's been lots of studies done that where Pakistan is consistently ranked among the world's most sort of philanthropic countries. And the charitable giving is both sort of institutional, it's personal, but it's in aggregate, it's humongous. So in addition to people exiting the public system by accessing private sector services, there is this reliance on this philanthropy sector. So how can we leverage that? Now that's going to have I think a strong role to play going forward, partnering up with that. But at the same time, from the public sector side, I think the need to strengthen and modernize our social insurance systems, which are in some ways, non-existent. We need to look for, expanding health insurance, employment-linked protection, and increasingly now old age and disability insurance are going to become important. And these are things that, we have started to work on. It's going to require a lot of macro sort of policy shift, because at the end of the day, people tend not to take risk because they have to save for their future, and the climate and economic shocks are getting only more and more frequent. So I think building a more inclusive social insurance system will be key. And then, of course, to sum it up, I mean, more private sector partnerships, deeper engagement at the local level with trusted local institutions, both private and philanthropic. It's going to be critical to convert Pakistan's social capital into that durable adaptive resilience.
Thank you, Sofia. All extremely important points made. And referring some of that to Ijaz Saab, you have the final word, sir. I know you have to leave as well, but very quickly, sir, whom are we tasking with, the job of resilience? Is it at local levels? The development partners have spoken, but who really ensures that it reaches the last mile?
Yeah, Salman, I'm afraid I'm going to be very, very quick. I should have left 15 minutes ago. Look, let's look at the world as it is. The world as it is that we have a totally collapsed public investment program. There just isn't the money to start big interventions. But fortunately, a lot of what we need to do is about adaptation. So it's a question of tweaking the technologies that we are currently working with and making sure that climate change resistance comes into those technologies, comes into those interventions. Fortunately, a lot of learning is to be done through exchange of knowledge. We just need to know how to do things better at all levels, but especially at the community level. And an opening for this has been made in all kinds of documents that talk about the needed intervention. So sharing of knowledge, learning from other countries. Bangladesh, for example, has done a very good flood adaptation program. The early warning systems work well. Places of safety are clearly identified, and it seems to work well there. what can we learn from other countries which we can adapt to our own situation. And finally, the World Bank still has a relatively large investment program in Pakistan. As a bilateral, FCDO has a large program in Pakistan. How can we make sure that these programs are tweaked to respond to this framework that you are developing, which is community level public goods, at the district level public goods, taking into account the inequalities that exist at the district level? So in sum, Salman and Senator, your work has just started. You really will need to work very hard to make the connection between the points where decisions get taken about how money is to be spent and your concern for communities at the local level. There's still a gap there. Faisal has done a great job in developing these indices. We now really need to take these indices to what to call the last mile to make them operational. With that, please allow me to make my exit. Thank you.
Yes, thank
Thank you,
you.
Dr. Abhi, very much.
Yes.
Saiba, over to you for your
Yes,
final
thank
thoughts.
you very much. As we run out of time, I want to thank everyone who made the time to look at the report and be available this afternoon for its first launch. I just want to quickly speak to two things. One is, of course, that we have tried to grapple with the concept of resilience at a very fundamental level. And when you engage in fundamentals, some of the findings are not necessarily a headline that is is breaking news. So while we all know that public goods and social capital are needed and the gaps are great, I want to say very quickly that the gap between the various cascades of government are something that we all see, not just in Pakistan or anywhere else. I think I don't need to learn this much from another country to understand that at the national or federal level, when Pakistan's first public planning for the budget or just the total public service outlay is done, it is done through something called the Public Sector Development Program. And that is the heart of the planning and resource allocation process, which then brings about a budget for the country, and then the provinces have their share and their whatever. So now I think that the first thing that we do need to speak about for bridging these gaps is not a listening exercise. I think we've begun the listening exercise, but what can investors and actors do, from private sector to foreign investors to large, public donors, international donors, multilateral as well as bilateral? What can they do to bridge the gap? The gap has to be addressed at the planning level first. It has to be cascaded down. It will then cascade down to the province once the federal budget and the federal planning documents appear with a climate and vulnerability component embedded into not just its language as a separate chapter or as a niche part of the planning process, but until it has to be embedded. Every outlay, for instance, the water resources, which is crucial to how we understand resilience in Pakistan, because water is life, really, and it's foundational to our economy and both urban and rural. And when, for instance, we are allocating resources for water, how will the listening that we begin at the community level, and since it's very different from mountain to delta, how will that listening translate into planning priorities? I think that is the point of this report and discussion, that vulnerability and fragility changes how can people actually respond to climate change. Do they even know what is climate change? As the High Commissioner remarked, sometimes they think it is an act of God because no one is communicating that it is not an act of God, other than 2 or 3 players in the country. And we see the ambassador here of Sweden saying, well, women have a great role to play from victim to agent, and they can be transformative. So, and Messrs. Bari and Ijaz both have a huge role in both developing the concepts in this report as well. And thank you, Sophie, for your very clear connection between how we can actually bring social protection to clear adaptation priorities that are reflected nationally. They will have to be reflected nationally and embedded nationally in a very simple document. It's called the planning document that appears with the national budget every year. That has to be the start. The language and the budgeting has to be reflected in that. If it is a separate niche project, then you're always going to be treating climate and fragility as a broad talking point. It has to move beyond that in our actual resource allocation and how we rethink what actual communities need from delta, from mountain to delta, because the needs are very different. And even if each province, federal programs that say go into a province, how will the PSDP close rejig programs or limited resources to say, okay, we are thinking of climate stress, and the first stress really in Pakistan is heat and water, to put it very, very bluntly, and to simplify it. Foundationally, then, simple low-cost solutions such as rainwater harvesting in every district will transform the experience of that district in conserving water, in treating it not as an infinite resource, and understanding that it's not an infinite resource when they dig a well or they waste the water, and also in consuming it with the care that a very limited, almost scarce resource needs in a century that is devoting major resources globally to conflict and geopolitical tensions than to sustainability at the ground level. So we are facing humanitarian crises even as we speak without a climate event, so to speak. So even if that is occurring at a struggle at the level of the household, where the women are facing their catastrophes every day as they come, micro and macro, that is the first intervention that has to happen. And I would urge all players in this room, in this web room, with influence and agency at the federal level, to say, look, we would really like to see this advance further into a realization that actually addresses a transformation or a repurposing of even existing resources, because we are asked to repurpose climate resources the minute there's a catastrophe. We have to acknowledge that we are on ground zero of a recurring and quiet catastrophe in people's homes. That's how the thinking changes, and that's how it will have to filter down. So I'm going to take more time. Thank you, Salman. And thank you to all of you for doing this. Please close with your acknowledgements. It took a village to do this.
Thank you, Senator Saiba. We'd, of course, like to thank our research team who have traveled the length and breadth of Pakistan: Adina Wajid, Arifa Zahoor, Nail Murad, and videographer Arbab Raza. Mustahsin Kazmi, who remains the paymaster and at JI. Our statisticians, Muhammad Ali Raza and Suhaib Akib, who constructed the Resilience Index, as well as the 360 participants, respondents all over Pakistan, and the senior experts who helped create our framework. Finally, we dedicate this to the communities who toil and struggle in the face of insurmountable odds. We have witnessed their resilience firsthand, but with this launch, as one participant said, our work has just begun. So thank you to everybody tuning in and watching. And yes, of course, Senator Saiba.
Yes, I want to finally quickly thank our peer reviewers as well, Dr. Zeba Sattar, Dr. Ijaz Nabi, Dr. Faisal Bari, who's here, who was with us, Dr. Haris Gazdar, and Amara Durrani, and of course Salman, who weathered a lot of physical, not physical, but verbal nonsense from me, and several rejiggings of this report. It is a work in progress as I see it, and thank you all for bearing with us, and we look forward to your advice and some pathways forward in building the connections we need to in this great country, which is facing the climate catastrophe, literally, as we speak in an everyday mode at the household and community level. So thank you for this.